Winston Churchill was born in 1874 in Blenheim Palace, a grand estate gifted to his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, for military triumphs. Though surrounded by luxury, his childhood was far from warm. His parents, Lord Randolph Churchill and Jenny Jerome, were distant. His father, a brilliant but cold politician, and his mother, a glamorous American socialite, were often absent. Young Winston longed for attention, writing heartfelt letters to his mother that often went unanswered. This loneliness planted the seeds of his fierce independence and inner drive. He sought affection through achievement, excelling in writing, reading history, and dreaming of glory on the battlefield. Even as a boy, he believed he was destined for greatness. The privilege of his birth gave him opportunity, but it was his ambition, shaped by isolation, that would turn him into one of the most resilient leaders in history.
Churchill's school years at Harrow were marked by rebellion and underachievement. He despised rote learning and often ranked near the bottom of his class. Yet beneath that unruly spirit was a sharp mind drawn to history, poetry, and language. His teachers noticed his talent for words even when his grades failed to show it. After Harrow, he set his sights on the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, determined to make his father proud. It took him 3 attempts to pass the entrance exam, but once in, he thrived. There, he discovered discipline, courage, and leadership, the core traits that would define his future. Upon graduation, Churchill was commissioned into the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. His education wasn't just academic, it was an awakening. Sandhurst transformed the rebellious boy into a soldier with purpose, ready to carve his name into history through action and ambition.
Restless and hungry for glory, young Winston Churchill sought adventure wherever the British Empire stretched. His first taste of action came in Cuba, 1895, where he observed Spanish forces battling rebels, and where he developed his lifelong habit of smoking cigars. Next came India, where Churchill served on the turbulent northwest frontier. Between battles, he devoured books on philosophy and politics, shaping his worldview amid the gunfire and dust of empire. He began to see war not just as duty, but as a stage for destiny. Then came his most famous early adventure, the Boer War in South Africa. Captured by enemy forces while working as a war correspondent, Churchill made a daring escape from a prison camp, crossing hundreds of miles of hostile territory to freedom. The story made him a national hero overnight, catapulting him into fame and straight toward a career in politics.
In 1899, during the Boer War, Winston Churchill's ambition nearly ended behind enemy lines. Captured while accompanying a British armored train ambushed by Boer fighters, he was taken to a prison camp in Pretoria. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. For Churchill, it was just the beginning. Under the cover of night, with nothing but his courage and a few bars of chocolate, he scaled a wall and slipped into the dark, leaving his fellow prisoners behind. With no map, no weapon, and a bounty on his head, he journeyed over 300 miles through enemy territory, hiding by day and walking by starlight. Against all odds, he reached the safety of a British-controlled mine, and within days, the newspapers back home hailed him as a national hero. The bold escape turned the ambitious soldier into a symbol of British defiance, and the world began to take notice of the young man who refused to be captured in body or in spirit.
Fresh from his adventures and newfound fame, Winston Churchill entered Parliament in 1900 at just 25 years old. But this was no ordinary debut. Churchill arrived as a man who had already faced bullets, prison, and destiny. Yet what made him stand out even more was his uncompromising independence. He began his career as a conservative, but soon shocked his peers by crossing the floor to the Liberal Party, driven by his belief in reform and fairness. Many called him a traitor, but Churchill called himself a servant of principle, not party. In Parliament, his fiery speeches, sharp wit, and refusal to bow to authority earned both admiration and resentment. He spoke not for popularity, but for what he saw as truth, defending the poor, supporting labor reforms, and challenging the old political order. The young rebel's courage was not just found on battlefields, it lived in his words, convictions, and defiance. Churchill was beginning to forge the iron will that would one day guide Britain through its darkest hour.
In 1904, Winston Churchill made one of the most shocking moves in British political history. He crossed the floor of the House of Commons, leaving the Conservative Party to join the Liberals. For many, it was an act of betrayal. For Churchill, it was an act of conscience. He disagreed deeply with the Conservatives' resistance to social reforms and free trade, believing the nation needed progress, not protectionism. When principle clashed with loyalty, he chose principle, a choice that would define his entire career. The move came at great personal cost. He lost friends, allies, and trust among the political elite. Yet, he never wavered. Churchill declared, "Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat," showing his signature humor even in controversy. By joining the Liberals, Churchill found new purpose. He became a champion of reform, helping to shape laws for social welfare and labor rights. His decision to cross the floor wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a declaration that courage means standing alone when conviction demands it.
As a rising star in the Liberal Party, Winston Churchill transformed from a daring adventurer into a visionary reformer. Appointed as president of the Board of Trade in 1908, he set out to modernize Britain's aging social and industrial systems. Churchill saw poverty and inequality as enemies just as dangerous as any foreign power, and he was determined to fight them. He championed labor exchanges, unemployment insurance, and old age pensions, laying the foundations of the modern welfare state. Working alongside Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and reformer David Lloyd George, Churchill helped craft policies that gave the working class new dignity and security. As Home Secretary, he introduced prison reforms and advocated for better treatment of prisoners, insisting that the mood and temper of the public in regard to the treatment of crime and criminals is one of the most unfailing tests of civilization. Churchill was not without controversy. His handling of strikes and protests sometimes showed a hard edge. But behind the steel was a man driven by a belief that government could uplift lives, not merely rule over them. In this period, he proved that leadership wasn't just about war and conquest, it was also about building a fairer society before the storm of history arrived.
By 1911, Winston Churchill's meteoric rise brought him to one of the most critical positions in Britain's government. First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. Europe was on edge, and Churchill saw what many others ignored. War was coming, and Britain had to be ready. He poured his boundless energy into modernizing the Navy, understanding that the empire's survival depended on mastery of the seas. Churchill championed the shift from coal to oil-powered ships, making the fleet faster and more efficient. He pushed for the construction of new dreadnought battleships, ensuring Britain would remain the world's dominant naval force. But it wasn't just about machines. Churchill revolutionized training, communication, and coordination,
preparing the Royal Navy for the modern age of warfare. He spent countless nights at the Admiralty, studying maps, ship designs, and the psychology of command. To his critics, he was reckless, too bold, too impatient. But to Churchill, complacency was the greatest danger. To improve is to change, he once said, and to be perfect is to have changed often. When the storm of World War I finally broke out in 1914, the Royal Navy, modern, disciplined, and ready, stood as the backbone of Britain's defense, a testament to his foresight and relentless drive.
In 1915, Winston Churchill's boldness met its darkest test, the Gallipoli campaign. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he envisioned a daring plan, open a new front by attacking the Dardanelles Strait in Turkey, striking at the Ottoman Empire and linking up with Russia. If it worked, it could shorten the war and save countless lives. But what began as a brilliant idea turned into one of the most tragic failures of World War I. Poor planning, outdated intelligence, and hesitant commanders turned the campaign into a nightmare. Allied troops, many from Australia and New Zealand, landed on rugged cliffs under relentless enemy fire. Months dragged on with horrific losses, disease, and despair. For Churchill, it was a personal catastrophe. Though not solely his fault, the blame fell squarely on his shoulders. The ambitious strategist who once inspired nations now stood humiliated. The Admiralty forced him out. The Empire's golden sun had fallen. Yet, even in disgrace, Churchill refused to collapse. "I am finished," he told his wife, "but I am not done." The fire inside him, the belief that destiny still had plans for him, kept burning. Gallipoli broke his career, but it also forged his character. From failure, he would learn humility, patience, and endurance, the same qualities that would later make him the man who saved Britain in its darkest hour.
After the Gallipoli disaster and the political backlash that followed, Winston Churchill's once rising star dimmed. By the 1920s and 1930s, he found himself in political exile, not formally banished, but isolated and ignored by the establishment he had once dominated. These years became known as his wilderness years. Churchill was out of office, out of favor, and out of power. Many dismissed him as a relic of the past, too outspoken, too unpredictable, too obsessed with empire and war. Yet while others sought comfort in peace and illusion, Churchill saw what others refused to see: the gathering storm. From his home at Chartwell, he wrote endlessly, painting and studying history. But above all, he watched Germany. As Adolf Hitler rose to power, Churchill's instincts sharpened. He read every speech, studied every move, and warned Parliament and the press that another great war was coming, one far worse than the last. "Do not suppose," he warned, "that this is the end. It is only the beginning." But Britain did not listen. They called him an alarmist, a warmonger, even mad. Newspapers mocked him. Politicians avoided him. Still, Churchill stood alone, a man shouting into the wind of denial. The wilderness years tested his patience, his pride, and his purpose. Yet, through the loneliness, he never lost faith that he was right. And when the storm finally broke and Hitler's armies marched across Europe, the world would turn once again to the man who had seen it all coming, Winston Churchill, the prophet of war, who would become its greatest defender.
It was 1940. Europe was collapsing under Nazi domination. France had fallen. The skies over Britain roared with enemy planes. The world watched as democracy trembled on the edge of extinction. And in that moment of fear, Britain turned to the man it once rejected, Winston Churchill. The same man they had mocked, doubted, and cast aside was now called to lead. King George VI appointed him prime minister, and with that, history shifted. When Churchill entered 10 Downing Street, he faced impossible odds. The British Army was cornered at Dunkirk. The nation's morale was fading. The threat of invasion loomed over every home. Yet, in the chaos, Churchill's voice cut through like thunder. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he declared to Parliament. It wasn't comfort, it was truth. And somehow, that truth gave hope. He worked tirelessly, day and night, directing the war effort, coordinating with Roosevelt, managing generals, and rallying the people. He walked among the ruins after air raids, cigar in hand, hat tilted, unshaken. To the British people, he was more than a leader. He was defiance made flesh. In every broadcast, his words turned despair into courage. His presence alone reminded them that Britain would never surrender. June 4, 1940. The British Army had just escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind their equipment but saving their spirit. The world waited to see if Britain would give in, if the island would fall like the rest of Europe. Then, Winston Churchill rose before Parliament, his voice steady, his resolve unbreakable. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Those words electrified Britain. They weren't polished propaganda. They were the raw pulse of a nation refusing to die. Every man, woman, and child listening knew what they meant: defiance, unity, and survival. Churchill understood that words were weapons, sharper than any sword, stronger than any army. His speeches became shields for the people, armor against despair. He turned language into a battlefield and victory into belief. As bombs fell over London and the night sky burned, the people repeated his words. They stood in shelters, holding one another, whispering, "We shall never surrender." In that moment, Churchill gave Britain more than courage. He gave them identity, the spirit of resistance that would echo across the world and across time.
Summer 1940. The fate of the free world hung in the balance. France had fallen. Hitler turned his eyes toward Britain, preparing Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the island. But first, the skies had to be conquered. The Battle of Britain began, an aerial war unlike anything the world had ever seen. Day after day, the Luftwaffe rained destruction upon cities, airfields, and factories. Britain's survival rested on a handful of young pilots, barely out of their teens, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes against overwhelming odds. Churchill watched from the rooftops, binoculars in hand, smoke rising over London. He knew this was not just a battle for territory, it was a battle for civilization itself. When others panicked, he remained defiant. "Hitler knows he must break us in this island or lose the war," he said. "If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free." And stand they did. The Royal Air Force fought relentlessly, outnumbered but unbroken. When victory finally came, Churchill addressed Parliament with the words that would echo through history. "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The skies cleared, Britain stood undefeated, and from that moment the world knew the island would not fall.
By 1941, Britain was bloodied but unbroken, standing alone against the Axis powers. Across the Atlantic, the United States still watched from a cautious distance.
But Winston Churchill knew that Britain's survival depended on friendship with America and on the man leading it, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Their relationship began with letters, personal, witty, filled with respect and trust. Though separated by oceans, the two men formed one of history's most powerful alliances. Churchill wrote, "It is fun to be in the same decade as you," and Roosevelt replied with warmth and quiet strength. They met face-to-face aboard a battleship in 1941, crafting the Atlantic Charter, a shared vision for a world free from tyranny. There, on the rolling waves, they pledged not just military cooperation, but the moral foundation of a new world order. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered the war, Churchill was jubilant. He said, "So we have won after all. England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live." From that day on, Britain and America fought as one. Churchill and Roosevelt planned strategies, shared secrets, and carried the weight of the world together. They laughed, they argued, and they dreamed of victory. It was not just an alliance of nations, it was an alliance of minds. Together, they forged the path that would lead to the downfall of Hitler and the dawn of a new era.
By 1943, the tide of war had begun to turn. The Allies had fought their way through North Africa and Italy, but Winston Churchill knew the ultimate victory would come only by striking at the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The question was how and when. Together with Franklin D. Roosevelt and later General Eisenhower, Churchill helped shape the most daring military operation in history, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. It would be a gamble on which the future of freedom itself depended. In war rooms buried beneath London, maps covered the walls. Red pins marked German defenses. Blow arrows traced the Allied assault. Every decision, the timing, the tides, the deception, had to be perfect. One mistake could mean disaster. Churchill agonized over every detail. He feared failure, but demanded courage. "This," he said, "is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." On June 6, 1944, D-Day began. The largest amphibious invasion in human history thundered across the English Channel. British, American, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches under fire, breaking through Hitler's fortress Europe. Churchill stayed awake all night, chain-smoking cigars, pacing the floor. When news came that the beaches were held, he exhaled deeply. The liberation of Europe had begun. D-Day was more than a victory of arms. It was a triumph of unity, courage, and vision, the moment when Churchill's long-held dream of freedom returning to the continent finally became real.
After nearly 6 years of war, countless losses, and unimaginable destruction, the dream Churchill had fought for finally came true. By early 1945, Allied armies closed in on Germany from both east and west. Cities lay in ruins, but hope was alive again. Churchill, worn but unbroken, traveled to Yalta and other wartime conferences, shaping the post-war world with Roosevelt and Stalin, determined to secure peace after so much pain. Then, on May 8, 1945, came the news. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Crowds flooded the streets of London, waving flags, cheering, crying with joy. Churchill stepped onto the balcony of the Ministry of Health. The crowd roared his name. With cigar in hand and the familiar V for Victory sign, he declared, "This is your victory." The people shouted back, "No, It is yours. But Churchill knew better. It was the victory of millions. Soldiers, workers, mothers, and children who had endured the darkest years and never surrendered. That night, as fireworks lit the sky over London, Churchill walked among the celebrating crowds. For the first time in years, there was laughter, light, and peace. The victory in Europe was not just the end of a war, it was the triumph of resilience, unity, and unyielding faith in freedom.
Just months after leading Britain to triumph in World War II, Winston Churchill faced a different kind of battle, a political one. In July 1945, the nation held its first general election in 10 years. Churchill, the heroic wartime leader, seemed invincible. Yet beneath the surface, Britain was ready for change. The people wanted peace, rebuilding, and social reform after years of sacrifice and destruction. When the results came, it was a shock. Churchill's Conservative Party was overwhelmingly defeated by Clement Attlee's Labour Party. The same man who had guided Britain through its darkest days was now out of office. But Churchill accepted defeat with dignity. He said, "They have a perfect right to kick me out. That is democracy." Though he was no longer Prime Minister, his influence did not fade. He remained a giant on the world stage, admired even by those who voted him out. The 1945 election marked the end of Churchill's wartime leadership and the beginning of Britain's transformation into a modern welfare state. For Churchill, it was a humbling reminder that even legends must bow to the will of the people.
In March 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to Fulton, Missouri, invited by U.S. President Harry S. Truman. There, he delivered one of the most influential speeches of the 20th century, a warning that would define the Cold War era. With his signature gravity, Churchill declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." He described how Soviet influence was spreading through Eastern Europe, dividing the world into two opposing camps, freedom in the West and tyranny in the East. At the time, his words were controversial. Many still saw the Soviet Union as a wartime ally, not a threat. But Churchill's foresight soon proved prophetic. Within years, Europe was firmly split and the Cold War had begun. The Iron Curtain speech transformed Churchill once again from a wartime hero into a global voice of warning and wisdom, urging unity between Britain and America to defend democracy against totalitarianism. It wasn't just a speech, it was the beginning of a new world struggle.
In 1951, 6 years after his shocking election defeat, Winston Churchill returned to power at the age of 77, older, wiser, yet still burning with determination. This second term was not marked by war, but by peacekeeping and diplomacy. Churchill focused on balancing relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, striving to prevent a nuclear catastrophe in an increasingly divided world. Though his health was failing, he remained a towering figure, his mind sharp, his presence commanding. He continued to champion European unity, warning that the lessons of the past must never be forgotten. Churchill's leadership and these later years symbolized endurance and vision, proof that even after the storms of history, he would not rest while the future of freedom was uncertain. This was his final act of duty, the last stand of Britain's indomitable lion. After retiring from politics in 1955, Winston Churchill spent his final years in deep reflection and creativity. No longer commanding armies or addressing parliaments, he turned to the pen and the brush, writing his monumental 6-volume History of the Second World War, which earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature. He also devoted time to painting and family, retreating to his beloved home at Chartwell, where he found peace among his gardens and canvases. Yet, even in quiet, he remained a symbol of courage and resilience to the world. Churchill's twilight was marked by fading health but undimmed spirit. When he passed away in 1965, nations across the globe mourned him, the man who had refused to surrender when darkness seemed inevitable. His legacy endures as that of a warrior, statesman, and wordsmith, a man who taught the world that leadership begins with unwavering resolve.
Winston Churchill's words were as powerful as his actions. They shaped nations, lifted spirits, and changed the course of history. His speeches remain timeless lessons in courage, perseverance, and defiance. Here are some of his most unforgettable quotes. "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. If you're going through hell, keep going. Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees all others. Never, never, never give up. We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. To improve is to change. To be perfect is to change often. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. Through war and peace, victory and defeat, Churchill's voice echoed a simple truth, that endurance, faith, and unbreakable will can light the darkest hour.